So now we're going to move on to chapter 26, and chapter 26 is about phylogeny and how we organize everything that is alive on the earth. So you've probably heard of genus and species. You may have even heard of like phylum and class and family. Those are all kind of groups that we can put organisms into so we can kind of organize where they are found. So phylogeny is actually looking at the pattern of how things kind of evolved. So I've got a picture here I can show you. I like this one better. So you can see here how it's kind of showing that there was a common ancestor for everybody and then everything kind of branched out from there. That's a phylogenetic tree, so that's where phylogeny comes from. Now, there's another field known as taxonomy. And taxonomy is classifying things and putting them into groups. So how we are in the subphylum Vertebrata, and we're in the phylum Chordata, and our, scientific name is Homo sapiens. All of that is taxonomy. And Carolus Linnaeus is going to be the father of taxonomy. And the thing you want to know about taxonomy is that it's always going to be in Latin or Greek roots. And that's because that's kind of the universal language of science. So if we were to take the names and actually put them to a phylogenetic tree, like here, although those are common names, this is going to be systematics, where we've kind of combined the tree with the names. So if they had scientific names on here. So it's kind of interesting because the way you use these is you can see evolutionary relationships, right? You can see that these two foxes are more closely related than, say, this fox up here and this fox, right? So you can kind of use the tree for that. So that's how all of those kind of play together. So I mentioned our species name, and our species name, sorry, I keep forgetting to do that. Our species name is going to be Homo sapiens. So there's two words there, and that's because your species name is composed of your genus and your species name. So if I was going to write that on the board, I was going to write it like this. Oops. Hopefully you can see that. So I wrote Homo sapiens up there, and the important things about what I wrote is that the genus, which is the Homo part of our name, is capitalized. The species, which is sapiens, is not, and you always write it in italics. Okay, so that's how you would write our species name. Okay, so the taxonomic hierarchy, what that's talking about is the different groups that we can put ourselves into. So there's domains, kingdoms, phylums, classes, orders, family, genus, and species. So domain is the biggest, most inclusive group, and then it gets more specific all the way down to species. So this that I've listed is in order from most general to most specific, and there are ways that you can use to kind of remember that. So I'll write those up on the board. So we have domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And so the way that you can remember it is make a sentence that will kind of put all this in order. So I say, did King Philip come over for good? And I was in college when I made this phrase up, so there was something I put for this S, but we'll put spaghetti to remain politically correct. But you can make that sentence say whatever it wants, and that way you can kind of remember the order that it goes into. Okay. So another word for phylogeny could be cladistics, and that's kind of drawing those phylogenetic trees once again. So when you do that, it's really important to make sure that if you're not using DNA and you're just using characteristics, that you sort out what's called analogy versus homology. And this kind of goes along with that divergent and convergent evolution that we talked about. So if something is homologous, that would be something that would suggest common ancestry. So if you remember when we talked about homologous structures, the arm of a human, the leg of a cat, the wing of a bat, and the flipper of a whale. Those are all homologous structures, and those suggest common ancestry. Now, analogous structures are going to be similar structures, but they're from way different ancestors. So that would be like the bird's wing and the insect's wing that really don't mean that they have any sort of stuff in common or any common ancestor. So it's really important to sort those out, because if you screw that up, then you're going to make a phylogenetic tree that is completely wrong. And it's funny because if you look at old phylogenetic trees, especially before DNA, it kind of goes that way, which is hilarious. Okay. So if we're going to group stuff into these large groups, we'll start with domains, because that's going to be the biggest, most inclusive groups. And there's 3 domains. So there's archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. Archaea are going to be the archaea bacteria, and they're known as extremophiles. They're like this crazy bacteria that can live in like under the ice and in anoxic conditions and crazy conditions like that. Then you've got your regular bacteria, which are all over the place. And then you've got eukarya, which are going to be all eukaryotic organisms. So anything that has eukaryotic cells. Then the domains can actually be broken into kingdoms. So the kingdoms, there's 6 of them, if you remember we talked about that. And they are Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, Protista, Archaea bacteria, and bacteria. So the way that it works as far as domains go is that the domain archaea has archaea bacteria kingdom in it, and that's it. The domain bacteria only has the bacteria in it, and then all these other 4 kingdoms right here are in the domain eukarya. Okay, so moving on. One way that we can actually figure out how to draw these trees is looking at the fossil record. And we've talked about how fossils work and how they form, and that's with the sedimentary rock, and then it's going to form those deposits, and then eventually that's going to get so pressurized that it forms rock. So there's a couple of different ways that fossils can form, and some of them are going to give us different information than others. So it's kind of interesting to see. So the first type is probably the type that you're most used to seeing, and that's going to be a mineralized fossil. And I've got a picture of a mineralized fossil over here. There we go. So here's a mineralized fossil. So what happens in this case is that all of the organic material, like the seashell and all of that, gets replaced by the local minerals. So what you're looking at here isn't actually seashells, it's actually seashells that have been changed into stone. Same thing as if you go to the museum and you see those dinosaur bones that have been fossilized. Those are mostly going to be composed of minerals, right? So that's how those form. Now the next type of fossil is going to be what's called an organic fossil. And it's called that because it has some sort of organic material trapped inside of it. Super awesome. First of all, they look really cool. Hopefully you can recognize that this is amber here, and amber used to be tree sap. And sometimes organisms get trapped in the tree sap. So if you watch Jurassic Park, they talk all about that whole thing. And so what's interesting is a lot of times you can extract DNA from these. Now, it's not as easy as they made it seem in Jurassic Park. I know, it's crazy that a movie isn't completely correct. However, what is cool is you can sometimes get DNA from there. I was actually working with a scientist who was getting pollen from organic fossils, and she was growing it and figuring out what plants were growing in the area at that time, and then she could figure out what the climate was like at that time, whether there was drought or whether there was a lot of water. So really, really interesting stuff that you can do with organic fossils. And I always just love to show this picture. I went into a store and they actually had a sink made out of amber with all these moths and butterflies trapped in it, and I was like, I have to have that. And then I realized it cost like $6,000, and I was like, someone else should buy me that. So anyway, kind of interesting, and also what you can see is they can make these in a lab now, so you know, kind of interesting too. All right, this is another example of an organic fossil. Super, super crazy. These are from peat bogs. And peat is just a bunch of organic material, you know, like leaf litter and, you know, mud and that kind of stuff. And they found these people in there from like BC times, which is a long time ago. And their hair is still on there. They have their leather hat still. I mean, they are perfectly preserved. So really, really interesting. And it has to do with the, you know, chemical makeup of the peat. But I mean, they have their teeth, they have their hair. It's just super interesting. Okay, and then another type of fossil you're probably pretty familiar with are going to be imprint fossils. And these are going to be ones just like, this is actually a picture from Dinosaur Ridge and up near Morrison. And these are, some people are like, well, it's just footprints, like who cares, right? But there's a lot that you can get from an imprint fossil. For example, you notice that there's some large ones here and there's some small ones here. So maybe that suggests that these guys cared for their young for extended periods of time. You can also see that there's a lot of different sized ones there, so maybe they traveled in packs. So you can get a lot of behavioral information from imprint fossils that you really couldn't get from the other types. So although some people get like, ah, whatever, it's a footprint, you can tell a lot from it, and I think that's pretty neat. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions here that you can go through when you download the PowerPoints, and you know, if you want to quiz yourself about the different types of fossils. Okay, so what people don't realize is a lot of people are like, well, haven't we found all the fossils out there? And we actually haven't. It's substantial, but it is an incomplete record. And so there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that there's a lot of species out there that just didn't fossilize. If you think about stingrays and sharks, they're mostly cartilage, so sharks only leave teeth. You know, a lot of insects are very difficult to fossilize, so that's another thing. A lot of fossils have been destroyed, so when people are building, especially developers, and they have a lot of money riding on something, and they find fossils, as long as they don't tell anyone, they can keep building. But if they tell someone, they have to stop. They may have to change the whole venue or do an excavation. So a lot of them get destroyed, and sometimes people just don't know any better. And then the last one is only a fraction of the fossils that are out there have been discovered. So it's estimated that we've only found about a third of what's out there. I don't know how they estimate what we haven't found, but they do. But that's kind of interesting too. So there's still a lot out there to be discovered, which is neat. Okay. So this next part is just talking about the geologic time scale. And if you've taken geology, you've gone over this a lot. But you may have heard of like the, you know, Cambrian era or anything era, right? Or, sorry, Precambrian era. So here you can see a list of the different eras, and what makes an era end is going to be when there's a mass extinction. And it's very interesting. There was just an article in National Geographic that was saying that maybe we're at the end of an era because of all these extinctions that are happening, and maybe a new one is starting. So some people got very upset about that, understandably, but just kind of for you to think about. Now, eras can be divided into periods, and periods are going to be marked by smaller extinctions. So just to kind of keep you straight on that. So in the next part, we're going to talk about phylogenetic trees and how they actually can build them using all of that information.